Hello and welcome to Controlled Vocabularies and Taxonomy. I'm your instructor, Robin Fay. This is class 2. And just as a reminder, we have our weekly class session, this as slides and a discussion. We do have our weekly discussion forums or daily. Some of you are posting more than weekly, that's fine. And then we have our exercises and assignments. In this particular class, our exercise is building a controlled vocabulary or taxonomy. So the work that you do will be cumulative. I will be grading and trying to get through things as they are turned in. So I will try to give you some feedback as soon as I can on resources, but by all means do continue onward in terms of working through the assignments. So just to sort of center ourselves and think about where we are, controlled vocabularies are a carefully selected, or you may think of curated, list of words and phrases. And then when they're organized in a hierarchy, they are a taxonomy. Especially in libraries and archives, we use thesaurus and taxonomy and controlled vocabulary sort of interchangeably. And so sometimes you'll see the Library of Congress subject headings referred to as a controlled vocabulary. Other times you'll see people refer to them as a taxonomy, and you may also see them referred to as a thesaurus. So, you know, we sort of view those words as very interchangeably. There is a little bit of a difference, of course, in that the taxonomy really gets to that sense of hierarchy and relationships between words. So a taxonomy is very much, it can be something very simple like this example, where you're looking at a broad category and then some sort of sub-organization or a category below that. And then you may have relationships that are on the same level between words and terms, and then further defining words and terms. Not every word or term has to be further subdivided. It really depends upon what your taxonomy looks like and what your taxonomy is dealing with in terms of the scope and things like that. So to kind of give us a sliding scale of uncontrolled terms, so terms that have no preferred words, we just use whatever we want to use, there's no structure to them, that would be where keywords would fall. So keyword is any word that appears in a resource or in its metadata. And for what we think about in terms of the web, a lot of what we see in terms of the web is really keyword driven. So these are any word that appears in a YouTube title, or appears in a YouTube tag, or appears in a blog post, or anything like that. So it's any word that appears in a resource or its metadata. In terms of libraries and archives, we often see keywords in titles. We see keywords in summaries and abstracts and notes about a resource. And you know, that's places where it's free text. We can sort of write whatever. Now, for libraries and archives, there are specific rules for how we enter or record information about the title. So it does have some rules associated with it, but the text itself is free text, meaning that we enter that text following specific rules. So a keyword is uncontrolled. There's no structure or real framework around it. There's no preference for which term would be chosen over another term. Although, and we talked about this last week, although sometimes we do, for the purposes of trying to explain to people what we're doing in terms of subjects especially, or topics, sometimes we'll call those keywords. So even though keywords may actually be really a controlled vocabulary, or it might even be a taxonomy, or it might be a thesaurus, or actually an ontology, and we're going to go through all of these in just a second, It could be any of those things, but for the purposes of labeling what it is to end users, sometimes we'll call that keywords or a keyword list. Anytime you see something that says it's a list, that may have some structure associated around it. Certainly, if you start seeing things nested or organized underneath topics, then you're starting to see some hierarchy. And that may be then a taxonomy. So these are not a one-to-one relationship, or it's not sort of a hierarchy of a relationship even within these terms. There's a lot of overlap between terms. There's what we label things for users of our resources versus what we know those things to be ourselves. But kind of moving from uncontrolled, so having no structure, having no preferred terms, no authority associated with it, no control or selection or curating of those terms. So moving from keywords, we kind of move over a category to controlled vocabularies. And this is where we get that define list. So we are going to be, and this could be, it could be a multi-layered list, but when we start talking hierarchy, that's where we move over to that definition of taxonomy. But a controlled vocabulary is just a defined list of terms with preferred terms selected to reflect a specific concept. That's the most basic definition of a controlled vocabulary. Now, you could argue the Library of Congress subject headings or all of these things. And so it may depend upon how you were educated or trained or how you engaged with the Library of Congress subject headings initially in terms of how you view them. So you may see aspects of each one of these in the Library of Congress subject headings, or you may say, no, the Library of Congress is a controlled vocabulary. The Library of Congress is a thesaurus. The Library of Congress is actually an ontology, because it does have aspects of all of those, and it really just depends upon the lens through which we're looking at things. So controlled vocabulary, that's just a defined list of terms. So it's defined, unlike keywords. Controlled vocabulary is defined, and it has preferred terms. So if you have other terms that you're referencing, look for cats, not feline, that sort of thing, then you're looking at more of a controlled vocabulary. Or if there's some process to guide you to the right term. So those preferred terms really are selected to reflect that specific concept. Now, one of the things we've been talking a lot about this week in discussion is, how do you know what that preferred term would be? What would you choose for that preferred term? And it depends on a lot of things. It depends upon the audience for that particular controlled vocabulary or taxonomy. Certainly for the Library of Congress, who is our audience? Well, the Library of Congress is first and foremost the Library of Congress. It's exactly what it says it is. So first and foremost, that is their role in the library world, is to be the library for Congress. So their subject headings, their topic terms really came out of that work. Now, the other thing that they did, the other thing that they are besides being the Library of Congress, is they're sort of our de facto national library. There are some others out there. National Library of Medicine would be another one. There's some other libraries out there that are at that high level too, compared to the, up there with the Library of Congress. And we do not, unlike many countries here in the United States, we do not have one national library, or we do not have a single recognized institution as a national library or the national library. Like I said, we have the National Library of Medicine, NLM. We also have the Library of Congress, and then when you start looking at universities and stuff, then there are some of those big universities that rise up in terms of reputation and credibility, especially in terms of this kind of work. We also have other institutions and museums like Getty that are also doing similar work that rise up to this level. So we are a little bit different in the United States, where we don't have sort of that singular, this is who, this is sort of who we take our best practices from, and this is who we look to set patterns and uh, discussions about controlled vocabularies and all that kind of stuff. So we don't really have that one. Of course, there are libraries internationally that use the Library of Congress subject headings. So they are engaging with this taxonomy, although they're not here in the United States. And I think that's been one of the things that we've been thinking more about in the last few years, is how international metadata work is, and how do we adapt what we've been doing and to continue to evolve, not only in a global marketplace, but in terms of a global metadata and information exchange. How can we continue to grow that? And especially when you're thinking about information sharing, there's a lot of advantages to being able to share information and be able to share knowledge and be able to share metadata practices and being able to share controlled vocabularies. Of course, coming from the Library of Congress, looking through the lens of the Library of Congress subject headings, those subject headings were developed in the late 1800s. They were developed here in the United States uh, at the Library of Congress, which of course is the Library of Congress. And, so that lens of looking at the universe of knowledge, like how all the different topics out there we could have, is very much organized through a very, United States viewpoint, and even a United States viewpoint at that particular time in history. Now, certainly the Library of Congress subject headings continue to grow and evolve. We do update terms, we do change terms, but it can be a little bit slow in terms of being able to change terms and update terms. Part of that is because of the structure of those records and also the process for reviewing those changes. Traditionally, the Library of Congress has not, and the government has not gotten involved in what is the preferred term for a topic in the Library of Congress subject headings. It's only been, say, in the last 10 years that that's sort of come under the microscope of government agencies and officials in terms of, oh, we have this controlled vocabulary, and they may not even call it a controlled vocabulary. They may call it a subject or a topic. And what preferred term should it be? So there may be that argument of, at the time that preferred term was established, that usage. So how was that preferred term used in the particular community? That may have come out of government publications or other documents. And so at the time that that term was established in the Library of Congress subject headings, in terms of at the time that term was chosen as the preferred term, there was also some evidence presented to the committee that makes the decision about what the subject heading term should be. And that decision body looks at the evidence that is presented. So here is the first recording of this particular term, and here's how it's used. And so I'm making the case for this term. So every time a subject heading is presented to the Library of Congress subject heading, there's a whole, like I said, a whole committee that works on this called SACO. As they're looking at it, they're also looking at the evidence that's presented. So the evidence that's presented is coming from the user community, but that user community really could be anything. It could be coming from government agencies and government publications. It could be coming from commercially published materials, books and DVDs and things like that. It could be coming from archives or some other museums or some other resources that are collected where usage is beginning to show up. And we just most recently, there's been a lot of discussion about changing of subject headings, but just most recently in the last 2 years, we've had to determine what the subject heading will be for COVID-19, right? Because that didn't exist or did not exist as COVID-19. Certainly there was the SARS COVID before that, but as this pandemic happened and people started writing, and it could be, certainly there was a lot of government publications related to COVID-19, but people are starting to do research on COVID-19. So academic institutions, academic faculty are starting to write on it. We're starting to see, all kinds of, people are writing memoirs. I mean, there's all kinds of things that people are now writing that are related to COVID-19. So what term would be the official term, that preferred term for COVID-19? How are we going to refer to that? So, that's one piece of it in terms of the Library of Congress subject headings. Of course, then the other part of it is, so that's a controlled vocabulary. There is a decision made about what that preferred term will be. Sort of moving over to the next category, the taxonomy. Of course, Library of Congress subject headings, many other topic lists, Getty being another one. They are a controlled vocabulary, so that's the defined list with preferred terms in a hierarchy. So there is that structure. So, for example, with the COVID-19, that one's fairly easy to see. We would put it under the category of diseases, or we might have a subcategory under diseases that's viruses, and we would put it there. But still, that one's fairly easy to see where it's going to slot into our hierarchy. When you get to things that are cross-domain or cross-discipline, virtual reality. So think about how many different applications there are for virtual reality. There's virtual reality in education, there's virtual reality in the military, and much of the virtual reality initially was through military applications. So you have virtual reality in the military, both training and in use of preparing people for warfare and to teach them, various activities. And then, of course, we have virtual reality in gaming, virtual reality in education, virtual reality in terms of especially health sciences. There's also virtual reality as it appears in literature. So when books are written and one of the themes has to do with virtual reality or something like that, there's all these different parts of it. So there's both things about virtual reality and things that include virtual reality. But virtual reality has to go someplace in terms of a category. And this is one of the challenges when you do have a hierarchy, is how do you represent that topic across multiple subject disciplines? Library of Congress subject headings kind of sticks virtual reality over in the technology side of it. And then there are similar topics. Virtual reality and religion is one. There are similar topics then across the various areas, putting them into the category where they go. Now, one of the things that happens when you have these categories is there's a decision that has to be made about where that topic's going to go. And we're going to talk more about hierarchies and relationships next week. But one of the things I want you to be thinking about is how, especially for next week, we're going to talk a lot more about this next week, is where you put a term, how that interacts with the user search process. Certainly, you can guide users to more broad terms or more narrow terms. And when you start thinking about Library of Congress subject headings developed in the late 1800s and what the landscape at that time period looked like, what the society of the United States looked like, then you also can start seeing where there's some bias baked in. And we're going to talk about bias a lot more because it is part of the hierarchy. And bias is both, it's not necessarily meant to be an overly negative thing, but it is a factor in terms of how these hierarchies are created. Because the hierarchy is created by a person or persons, and they make the decision of where that term goes, or whether or not there is a term for that particular topic. And so, for example, in Wikipedia, if you do a lot of searching in Wikipedia, there's been a lot of projects in the last, I would say the last 5 or 6 years to do things like add more women artists or add more artists of color or add more women rappers or areas where various demographic groups haven't been represented equally. And this is not just a taxonomy issue, and it's not just a hierarchy issue, and it's not just even a content issue. It also has to do, of course, with who is writing these materials, who is creating these materials that we are collecting or describing, because that also is reflected in terms of what terms are represented. So it gets very sticky. There's lots of different ways where bias comes into it. And sometimes it's coming from the community in terms of what materials are written or created, what videos are produced, who is producing those videos. We see this in gaming quite a bit, where gaming has traditionally been a very male-centered arena. And that impacts sort of what the default view is of gaming. And I think, there's a lot of jokes about sort of, what does a gamer look like and things like that. We're now starting to see that shift a little bit. But the reality is there's been many populations that have been gaming for a long time, but they haven't really been represented in sort of culture, and they're not necessarily visible. So one of the things taxonomy also does is, in terms of not only the placement of those terms, but the presence of those terms, so getting to that controlled vocabulary part of it, then it does give a visibility then for those specific terms. So there's lots of areas between the controlled vocabulary, what term we choose, and then also where we place it in the hierarchy. If we have a hierarchy, where we place it in the hierarchy, and how that can either lead the people searching our resources using our controlled vocabularies and taxonomies to make assumptions, or it supports their worldview or assumptions that they may have. Now, it's sort of one of those areas of ambivalence, because you want your controlled vocabulary and taxonomy to represent the community that it's targeted at, that the community that's going to use it, because those are the sorts of things that they're going to be looking for and expect to look for. So there is that piece of it. And then there's also thinking then about, when you're doing that, what bias and assumptions are you supporting or representing in your taxonomy as well? And, are there ways that you can make it a little more equitable, and also provide a potential growth opportunity as maybe more materials are written, or more videos are created, or more games are created, so that there is a place for those topics when there are resources to describe about it. So it gets very interesting when you think about that. And like I said, we'll talk much more about hierarchy next week, but it's a very, to me, it's a very interesting idea to look at the actual structure of the hierarchy, look at the choices for the words and a controlled vocabulary, especially something old like the Library of Congress subject headings. Another one that's very old is the Dewey headings. So that's another one that's really interesting to look at in terms of the hierarchy and structure, because those vocabularies are so old. And although we do update them, it's a slow process. So it's easier sometimes to see sort of the state of where society was reflected in our controlled vocabularies and taxonomies from that time period. A thesaurus then is a little less exciting. So this is kind of what I call the complete vocabulary. So this is when you have your controlled vocabulary. So you have your controlled vocabulary, you have your words, you have your hierarchy put together. And this is really what your final project is going to be in this class. So you're going to take your list, which you're working on, and you're going to organize it. So you're going to have to figure out your synonyms and all of those other words, and to figure out what your preferred term is going to be for specific concepts related to your larger concept topic. And then the sort of the last part of it, although it's good to be thinking about it now, is to be thinking about who your target audience is going to be, because you will be writing information about the vocabulary itself. So this is going to be how this vocabulary would be used, what the scope of this vocabulary is, as well as any other additional information, the title of your vocabulary, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, we won't really be working with ontology so much in this class, but I did want to mention it because it is something that appears as a word when you start looking at controlled vocabularies and taxonomies, the ontology aspect. And the ontology aspect is taking that thesaurus, and then it's providing even more structure around it, and typically logic. So ontologies, we frequently see a controlled vocabulary as a taxonomy, so it has that structure built into it. And we then take that list with its hierarchy, and then we're going to apply some additional structure around it. And this is where you start seeing like the metadata code itself, or this may be where you start seeing linked data being used. So rather than recording a subject term, you would actually link out to a record or link out to that representation of that subject. So ontologies are very helpful when you are really starting to look at interchangeability of metadata, or you're looking at being able to map from one system to another. Being able to tell the system you're using a specific ontology and have it understand that and be able to apply it is useful. So like I said, we won't talk too much about ontologies because that deals a lot more with the sort of the mechanics and the structure of it. And sometimes you will see people call a controlled vocabulary an ontology. You see this more in the semantic web world. When you start getting out to the semantic web world, they will occasionally call things a controlled vocabulary. A lot of times they just skip right to ontology and they'll just call everything an ontology. So if you're out in the semantic web world and you see something that says ontology, take a look at it, because it may be something that is truly an ontology and you can see that structure and logic applied to it, or it may just be a controlled vocabulary that they're calling, or a taxonomy they're calling an ontology. So an ontology can be all of these things, and it can also be at the very heart and center of it because it has to do with that structure. So goals of a controlled vocabulary. These should be something, by now you should have a good sense of what the goals of a controlled vocabulary is. But I would challenge you to think about these goals as you are working on your controlled vocabularies and taxonomy. So you're going to think about choosing one term or phrase as the preferred term. You're going to selectively choose and define your synonyms. And for some of you, you may have a lot of synonyms that you're sorting through. And my suggestion is to sort however is useful for you. So for week one, you didn't have to do much sorting. It's just kind of get a group of terms, but you will be working on sorting out those terms. You may also find in the course of sorting out terms, I like to use Post-it notes. This can be really helpful for me. A whiteboard can also be helpful. And a whiteboard can be helpful too, because you can also do your hierarchy there and move things around. Same thing with Post-it notes. You can do Post-it notes. You can do like 3 different colors or 4 different colors, and you could say yellow's at the top level, and then I'm going to put pink is going to be my second level. And you could, you know, on your window or your wall or any place you have room to put out Post-it notes, you could use Post-it notes to help figure out not only your preferred terms. You can use Post-it notes or index cards, whatever works for you, color-coded index cards. You can take your Post-it notes, move them around, and that can help you with your hierarchy when you get to that point too. So There's lots of different ways to do this work. And there's also online tools to do this work. I know that there's like Jamboard that you can use from Google. So if you're a Google person, that could be something you might take a look at. I've used some of the mind mapping tools to do this kind of work before. There's lots of different things you can use to organize this. So I'm not going to tell you what tool works best for you. I'm such a Post-it note fan, but you do whatever works for you. But you're going to need to look at your terms and pick the one term that is going to be your preferred term. Now there's a lot of different ways you can choose the preferred term. It may be from the resources that you've looked at that you're using as your word stock, which term appears the most. That may be one thing you want to look at. What term is most currently in use? So if there's a term in your particular subject domain that is not being used very much anymore and has been supplanted by a new term, then you might want to consider current usage. Once you kind of figure out your preferred term, if you have terms that are the same but mean different things, that's where you're going to have to disambiguate or separate those terms out. So if you have terms that are spelled the same, but that mean something different, then you're going to need to account for that difference. Now, you don't have to account for every single difference. And it may be that you're just going, if it's not used in your community and that usage does not appear in your community, you don't have to go out to thesaurus.com or the dictionary and find all different variants of what that particular word means. If it's not used in your community and it would not appear in the scope of your vocabulary to begin with, then there's no reason, and for the purposes of this assignment, there's no reason to go out, like I said, to dictionary.com or a thesaurus and try to account for everything. Now, if you are building something in real life and your users are going to be across all subject areas, so let's say you're going to build something for your institutional repository, or you're going to build something to use in YouTube, where everybody in the whole world is potentially going to be using your vocabulary, then in that case, you probably do need to account for at least the most common variations, because your community is everyone. And it's okay if your community is everyone. I mean, certainly it makes it a little bit more challenging. You're going to have a little bit more work in terms of defining all the different variants. You may need to account for language use, especially even if you're looking at English language use. There's a difference between Australian English, UK English, US English, Canadian English, and then even regional dialects. Now, do you have to account for all the regional dialects? For the purposes of this exercise, I would say no, because I would say at least most people in the United States have a basic understanding of sort of at least a baseline vocabulary. But in terms of those other countries that are also English language speaking countries, then it might be something where you would want to account for at least the most common usages. You're also going to then identify the relationships between terms. We'll be talking more about this next week. Related terms are terms that are similar and have some relationship to each other. These appear as RT in controlled vocabularies and taxonomies. You can also have the ability to create cross references. So you can say see also, use this term instead, things like that. If you have a hierarchy, you're going to define your broader terms. So that's your BTs, and your NTs, your narrower terms. So those are further down the hierarchy. And relationships can be used to build different search displays. So there's lots of different ways these can be used, and not all systems are going to allow you to have a hierarchy. So especially when you start getting out into the web world, some content management systems will allow you to have a hierarchy, and some have a very flat structure. So you have different ways of thinking about how you're going to create or choose your terms and phrase construction. So certainly we've talked a little bit about hierarchical versus other types of relationships. We'll talk more about this next week. We've talked about controlled versus uncontrolled terms. So you may also, depend on what, if you're already working with an existing resource and there's some tagging that's happening, you may look at those tags and see that could be another source. Look at those tags and make a decision about whether or not you want to include them as part of your controlled vocabulary or make them a synonym and refer people. So, that's sort of another option too. If you already have existing terms, are those terms going to be part of your controlled vocabulary as potentially preferred terms as part of those hierarchy? Or are they going to be a synonym and you're going to refer or cross-reference people to those other terms? Then there's also, and these two terms are more frequently seen in Library of Congress subject headings. And we don't talk about them as much as we used to. So I feel like this is going away, but I just wanted to mention this for the librarians and archivists that you may see these terms. So there's the term pre-coordinated and post-coordinated. Pre-coordinated is where you will see subdivided terms. So this will be a hierarchy. And these are used to create compounded complex concepts. And we'll look at an example in just a second. Whereas post-coordinate is single concepts in your basic terms. And these are also considered to be things that our users input. So this definition gets a little bit squishy here, and really, I wouldn't get, especially for those of you not working with anything related to library stuff, I wouldn't get too hung up on the pre-coordinated versus post-coordinated, because I just think this concept's going away. But I do know that it is still in existence, so I did want to mention it. So pre-coordination. Pre-coordination is the combining of terms into one preferred term or heading. In Library of Congress, we call those headings, in anticipation of a search on that compound heading. Usually they're indicated by a single dash. And then again, post-coordination refers to single words or the user combining terms. So that might be like a Boolean search or combining terms even in a natural language query where they're just going to put in some terms. As I mentioned, this is an older concept in terms of data, and it also has to do with how our early systems could handle subject-related data. So in early systems that had controlled vocabularies, you could not, often you could not have, in terms of the data side of it, spaces between words. And so if you wanted a compound word or you wanted to put two words together, then you would have to use some kind of punctuation in between them. And so that the single dash is just sort of what came out of it. Pre-coordination does still appear, especially in the earlier controlled vocabularies like the Library of Congress subject headings. So here's an example. And those of you who are librarians probably look at this and went, oh, that's what it is. Those of you who are not librarians, maybe you went and looked at it and went, oh, that's what it is. So we have money, and then we have, so this is something about, well, it's juvenile literature, and it's about money in the United States during the colonial period. So that's what our book or DVD or whatever is about. So we have specific rules for how we record those bits of information in Library of Congress subject headings. And we can't go too far in Library of Congress subject headings because that's not what this class is about. But I did want to mention that. As opposed to, we just have somebody who's going to type in money, United States, history, colonial period. And maybe they can select or further define by juvenile literature or not. So that's sort of the choices, that sort of what those two differences mean. And like I said, that pre-coordination in terms of how we define that is really based upon what comes from the Library of Congress subject headings for the most part. I've given you, for those of you who are interested, I have given you a link that you can spend some more time with. This is an older document. Remember, I said I feel like this is going away. Our systems can handle this information a different way, but it is something that you will especially for the library and archivist of you, you will encounter this word still floating around in things. So I wanted to mention it. Back in the early days of searching, and that's really where this quote came from, there was a feeling or some research, there was some research done with this as well, that these pre-coordinated strings were much better than even doing like a Boolean search and adding things together. Is that still true? I would argue that it is not. But we haven't done as much research on this because we really do. Our subject headings are still formatted this way, but the mechanism of how that works in terms of the mechanics is much different in our newest systems. So they do still look like this. If you go into a library catalog and you're looking at subject headings, they still look like this, but the system interacts with it much differently than it did in the early days of systems. So one of the things that libraries and archivists are challenged with is that we started creating electronic data in the late 1960s. Yes, late 1960s. So what did not exist before the late 1960s? Well, some of you, me, but what else didn't exist yet? Well, certainly not social media, not the web, not mobile devices, certainly not virtual reality. I mean, there's so much that did not exist in that time period. And our systems were very different from what they are now. So we are both, for libraries and archivists, both tied to the past while trying to move forward. And we're trying to get out of the past, but we do encounter it in places. So back to our more generic sort of looking forward in terms of controlled vocabularies. So terms, that's really what we're talking about for this week. That's your defined list with your preferred terms and variant terms of a specific domain or topic or defined scope. So that's really your challenge here at the beginning, is to come up with a list. And so you're looking at a lot of different resources. You have a domain topic or defined scope of what this vocabulary taxonomy will be. I think it seems like everybody's going to be more in the taxonomy category, and we'll have some hierarchy. I hope so, because it's more interesting to have it that way, I think. But within that, you'll then need to figure out what your preferred terms are. So this will be some of your exercises going forward. What will your preferred term be? And then what are going to be the variations on that term? What are going to be your synonyms? And then what do you need to separate out from those? A controlled vocabulary is then used to label the content through its use of terms. So that may be helpful for some of you who are working on real life projects. How would this term be used to label the content that we already have? Would it be useful to label it in these ways? And then, of course, organized into a taxonomy, that's where we come upon the relationships. So I've talked a little bit about how our controlled vocabularies and taxonomies help facilitate user searching. It helps in multiple ways. And this is really the heart of why we're doing this. You know, probably all of us love to organize, and it's kind of being able to see how the controlled vocabulary works and the hierarchy and be able to follow that hierarchy. It's almost like a little secret door, right, into how these systems all work, or don't, that they don't have a controlled vocabulary, and how hard it is to find something, and how it's hard to find the relationship between resources because there's nothing that exists to connect them in that way. So we see both sides of it. We see how things work, what the challenges of those systems may be, Library of Congress subject headings being a good example of that. And then we also see when we encounter places where there is no controlled vocabulary or there is no taxonomy, and how limited that can be in terms of finding things in our experience. Of course, Controlled vocabularies also help in terms of when the user language, and by language, it can be the actual language that a user is choosing in terms of what language they speak or write in. It may also be their vocabulary of choice. So it can be their language in terms of what language they're actually speaking in or reading in, writing in, or it may be their vocabulary of choice. And then terminology and how those differ. So, we see this a lot, especially with sort of emerging technologies, the medical profession, anything that's sort of a new topic where we may not have the subject heading or the preferred term has not really shaken out yet. Like we haven't quite figured out what that preferred term is going to be because people are calling it a lot of different things. And for example, with virtual reality and augmented reality now has a very specific meaning attached to it. In the early days, virtual reality and augmented reality were sort of synonymous with each other. And they are related, but they are not the same thing. So augmented is when you're in more of a real space and you have that additional technology. And then virtual reality falls under like the headsets and things like that. So they are similar and related, certainly related on multiple levels. They're both technology, they're both interactive. There's all that, all of that. They typically require some kind of device. There's all of that, but they also differ in terms of what their actual scope is. But that was a challenge in the early days of trying to explain that kind of technology is which term is going to be best. So there was a proposal, at least for the Library of Congress subject headings, there was a proposal that was sent forth. Same thing with Getty. There's a proposal that's sent forth. There's a discussion about it, and this decision is made about what that preferred term will be, and it will be entered into that taxonomy. Controlled vocabularies, in theory, and we could argue all day about how successful this actually is, assist users in finding all resources on a specific concept regardless of a specific term. So whether or not they have entered the right term for that particular thing, they should be able to find it through those cross references, in theory. It also assists in co-locating or pulling together resources with similar concepts. And this really relies on relationships and that taxonomy, so the hierarchy. Assist in guiding users to more broad or more specific concepts. There's, again, example of taxonomy of work. And it can also expand users' research vocabulary. And this may be true especially to those who are new to a particular field of study. So, as you become more immersed in that particular field, then, just like in this class where you're learning, all the different, or not all the different, but a lot of the different vocabulary terms related to controlled vocabularies. When you go forward and you're looking at things, you should have a little better understanding of what ontology is, a little bit. That one's kind of complex, I think, but ontology versus controlled vocabulary versus thesaurus. Of course, we've talked about this already, but controlled vocabularies solve the problems of all the variations of concepts and the synonyms that go along with them, as well as other words that may be related to them. So in short, and this is a good thing to remember too, in terms of thinking about your vocabulary you're creating, in short, the controlled vocabulary reduces the ambiguity inherent in normal human languages where the same concept can be given different names and to ensure consistency. So that's one of the things for you to think about. Now, I've given you a lot of terms here. You don't necessarily, I'm not grading you on whether or not you've learned all these terms, but I did want to kind of break them down because you will see them throughout readings about controlled vocabularies, and especially when you're looking at articles about controlled vocabulary vocabularies that's really focused on terms. So we have homographs, and homo meaning same word, but different meanings. So that's an important one if we have a vocabulary where we have the same word or the same word appears and it's used different ways. Synonyms, words that mean the same thing or very, very, very close. So, words that mean mostly the same thing. Now, it could be there's going to be a little gradation of a hierarchy here. So it may be what you actually think of as synonym once you actually think about what those terms are and you see how those terms are used by your community. You may find that one is a little bit more broad or one's a little bit more narrow of the other. So sometimes synonyms, when they don't mean exactly the same thing, that can be an indication that you have either a related term, so a term that doesn't fall under that grouping, but is related, or you have something that's a synonym. Polysyms is a word or phrase that has multiple meanings that are typically related. You may or may not encounter this in your vocabulary at all. It's really depending upon what kind of vocabulary you're working on. But an example would be, I'm going to get something to drink. Meaning I'm going to go get it could be water, it could be soda, it could be tea, whatever. Or I'm going to get a drink and I'm going to the bar and I'm going to have alcohol. So, it can be something like that. And we actually have a lot of these in the English language. I don't know so much about other languages in terms of how often this comes up, but I do know at least there are some in other languages. And then, of course, there's bijection, which is the relationship. And we're going to talk much more about relationships going forward, but you have relationships that are one-to-one, one-to-many, that kind of thing. Nice diagram. I would say as you're looking at your words and trying to sort out what they are, this is a good diagram to take a look at, or good outline to take a look at. And I've also given you a chart here of reconciling terms. So what the pronunciation is, and you notice I have an asterisk next to pronunciation because different, and we're also talking about English language. So, pronunciation, even within other communities of language, is going to again be different. Even within the English language, of course, we have different communities of practice, both regional and internationally, or internationally from here in the United States. So internationally meaning everyone outside the US. If I were in England, internationally would mean the other, would mean the US. So even our notion of things like what's international depends upon where you are seated. But pronunciation, mostly, if it's a homophone, mostly should be the same. It's going to sound the same. That's what homophone means, sounds the same. So that would be a verbal word where it is spelled differently but sounds the same. Homograph is written, so that's a written thing. So the word is written the same, but it has different meaning. So both a homophone and a homograph have different meaning. So if you had those appear in your word list, then you would need to reconcile them. You would need to figure out, is this a variation? Does this need to be a synonym? Or do I just say it's not used that way? Or do I define this specific term in a way to make sure that I've excluded these or one of these? You may only have one of these. So when you're vocabulary mapping, when you are creating and defining your vocabulary, you can choose to exclude these and say, not dealing with them. My community would not encounter these. You can map them to their place in the hierarchy if they have a relationship to a preferred term. So that's kind of your two choices. You can just discard them. They're not going to be relevant to my controlled vocabulary, so I'm going to discard them. Or you can map them to the place in the hierarchy and define them. So you would need to define how they're being used. Now, in practice, for some of you who have a very niche controlled vocabulary, topic, you may not encounter any of these. For those of you who are doing something that's going to be more global in reach, or at least global in terms of English language global, then you may encounter these and would need to address them. A homonym, that means pronunciation the same, spelling the same, different meaning. Anytime you have words that are similar but have a different meaning, and it can be similar in the fact that they're spelled the same or they sound the same, but anytime the meaning is different and it has some similarity to your preferred term, then you need to account for that. And like I said, you may just exclude it and say, that's not going to really appear in my community of usage in terms of this vocabulary. So I'm just going to make the decision to exclude that. Or you may make a decision in terms of defining your particular term and say it is this, but does not include these other things. Or you may put it into your hierarchy as part of the relationship someplace. These are, so the excludes, I think, are a little bit easier. You know, if you have these kind of things, how do you account for them? And in terms of your documentation, in terms of your spreadsheet you'll be doing, you will be kind of going through your list and looking to account for them. When you would be working on your controlled vocabulary and practice, this would be one of the things you're going to consider too, in terms of what things are going to go into the, this term is used in this way, but does not mean this. The other things, of course, you have things that are synonyms or the same word. Now, the same word you'll need to figure out. I think the same word on the surface seems very easy because pronunciation's usually the same, not always. Spelling's usually is the same, but not always. Sometimes you have variations of spelling, especially we have the British spelling and the US spelling. Color with a U. You know, if you're going to be encountering users who might be using either, then you would want to choose your preferred term, and your preferred term could be based upon where you are located geographically, or it could be based upon what term is more common in that particular community. And then you would want to add that synonym for color with a U. So for synonyms, you are going to want to map them as synonyms, and things that would fall under this category, well, they're not quite synonyms, but I kind of put them all in the same bucket as synonyms, but words that you would want to consider mapping into your vocabulary. So you have words that you would add to your exclude column, or you would define in terms of your scope, and you'll have a place to talk about that. So you'll have a place in the spreadsheet when you're working on that to actually talk about these different categories. And then you'll also have, and I think these can be a little bit more work, because I think it's pretty easy to see, well, these are things that I want to talk about and I need to address in my list, but they would not be something that I would actually choose as putting in a vocabulary topic for a person to choose from. I do want to address them though, because they would come up. Synonyms is where you're going to probably spend more time, because you'll have to be thinking about what your preferred term is going to be, and then what are you going to do with those synonyms? So think about, in addition to just regular synonyms, think about also different spellings like color and color, scientific terms versus common terms. And you may even map common typos here or variants of spelling. So gases with 2 S's, gases with 1 S, settee versus sofa. Someone in a furniture design or interior design program would probably see settee versus sofa as different. There's probably some small differeces, nuance of difference between those. If you're conversely doing an art, maybe an art design thesaurus or something like that, you might just say settee, we're going to choose sofa, and settee will be a synonym for that. So we would refer people who type in SETI to see SOFA. So examples of scientific terms versus common terms. Now, if you were doing a veterinarian database and you were doing a veterinarian related controlled vocabulary, then you might want to actually account for both of these. And this may be something where choosing the preferred term, you'd really have to think about that community. Because as a new, say, vet tech student, I might, if I were searching for something on the website, I might search for dog because, you know, I'm new, I haven't learned all the terminology yet. Whereas, of course, if I've been around for a while and I know all of the scientific terms, then I might search for canines, or I might search for Canis lupus familiaris. I might search the whole thing. So, you know, I might need to account for those synonyms a little bit differently and even account for sort of the multiple parts of it. So I can merge them into one with that preferred term and then say, you know, here's variations, or I can record them as synonyms. So you have some choices there too. So we've already talked about some of these, the popular term versus the technical term. Scientific term also falls in here. Really think about the audience because that's going to make a little bit of a decision in terms of what the preferred term is going to be. We already talked about pre-coordinated and post-coordinated. I don't think you need to think too much about that for this particular assignment, but I wanted to mention that. And here's another example where you have merchant marines and officers versus merchant marines and officers. But I think you definitely need to think about, depending upon your controlled vocabulary, those what would be scientific or technical terms versus popular terms. Other things to consider, the word form. Are you going to use plural or singular, dog versus dogs? Variance in spelling, we've already talked about that, or typos. Sequence and form for phrases. So we talked about this a little bit the first week about how some phrases may have a different formatting. And this is especially true in older controlled vocabularies or controlled vocabularies that are community sourced. Sometimes community source vocabularies don't have really strict or don't have a list of best practices. And you'll see energy conservation, and then you'll see conservation of energy, and then you'll see conservation, comma, energy. Because different people just think of how that phrase should be structured differently. So that'll be something to consider if you have phrases. What is going to be your best practice for how you would choose that preferred term? And then applying it across your vocabulary so it's the same. Abbreviations and acronyms. So we have MS versus multiple sclerosis with parens and MS, the MS and parens. Which one of those would you choose? It's probably going to depend upon your community. I would be more inclined to go with either the second or third choice because MS could be an abbreviation for so many things. Labels that need qualifying to sort out the difference. You have read the musical group, read the actor, read a movie. So you'd need to, trying to sort out what those would be. Typically, when you are qualifying a term or a phrase, the first time in a vocabulary that you use that term or phrase, you typically do not qualify it. You will qualify it when you need to repeat that term. And of course, this is a term that has different meanings. So, read, but we're talking about a musical group. Read, we're talking about the actor read, or read the movie. So in this example, read the movie was the first thing that we were talking about. And of course, then maybe we have read the color. So we may have another red in there. But we have read the movie. That's the first thing we're talking about. So read, we would need to define that term for read in this particular little situation here. we would need to define the term red to mean the movie, because that was our first use, and we're going to say that red's the movie. Or conversely, it may be red is defined as the color. And you see this in Wikipedia. If you look at search for prints, you'll see how they've handled separating out the different uses and meaning of the word prints. There's other ways of doing this. And Wikipedia actually talks about disambiguation when they do this. Typically, how you do it in a controlled vocabulary, though, when you actually want to have a term in the list, is you're going to add some kind of qualifier to it. So something that looks like this. Now, why would you not go back and qualify that first use of that preferred term? So read the movie in our example here. You could, but it's not necessarily from a controlled vocabulary preferred term standpoint. It's not seen as a requirement that you would go back and change those. And part of the reason for not changing things is because if you have a database or if you've used that controlled vocabulary term someplace, whether or not you would need to update that data every place that's used it. And this could even be like in a blog post, it could be on a website, it could be your YouTube and your tags, it could be in a library catalog, it could be an archive. If you change the preferred term for red, which we scoped as a movie or the movie, and we are going to then change our term to red and put movie in parens next to it, then we would have to change any of the data that uses that former term. Now we can do that, and depending upon your system and whether or not, how your system interacts with data, that may be a lot of work or it may be no work. But that's typically why you do not see headings changed or terms changed unless they just really, really need it. And then we've talked a little bit about the multilingual aspect as well. We've already talked about words used by the community, scientific, legal terms, or another category, medical terms, things like that. For example, here's my example of robots. So, if you are in maybe on a website, even if it's just a website where they're writing about technology and they're writing about all kinds of technology, they just might have one category for robotics, and they're putting all their blog posts about robotics into that one category because they want people to easily be able to find everything in the robotics category. They may not have the ability to search across categories. They may not have the ability to have a hierarchy. So just kind of stick everything in robotics. However, if this is a blog or a journal that is about the robotic field, then I would really want to get much more granular because everything would just go in the robotics category and I'd have one I'd have one term across my whole entire website, right? We talked a little bit about bias. We'll talk more about bias in the future and about relationships because I think that's an interesting part of it. We talked about outdated terms, but that may be something to take a look at, depending on what your particular controlled vocabulary is, and then how you would handle those. And, here's an example of different audiences and different disciplines and how they view and what the synonyms might be. So we have here, this is taxonomy as used in botany. So this is the word taxonomy, and all the different synonyms that, or not all the different, but many of the different synonyms you would see through the lens of the botany domain. If we go over to classification, which is sort of our umbrella, you see we get a lot of different terms. And so that's why taxonomies and vocabularies, are really interesting and really challenging to deal with because you're really looking at, if you're looking at a specific domain or discipline, we're doing something for the botanist, that would be relatively easy. We've got all of these synonyms and we're going to say, if you have any of these terms, see taxonomy. Some of these terms I don't feel like really falls would be a good synonym for taxonomy. So I'd probably do more like related terms for some of these. But anyway, that may be something to kind of think about, is to kind of look at these and go, well, some of them feel like they fall into taxonomy, and then taxonomy as defined by botany. So the study of vegetation, things like that. Of course, taxonomy means something very different for us, right? Taxonomy in botany is the classification and study of vegetation. So how vegetation is organized and how it is studied in that way. Taxonomy for us has to do with the organization of information and how we order that information. So when you look at these two domains or disciplines, they're like completely unrelated, right? I mean, they're sort of related in the taxonomy. We look over here and the information side of it and classification side of it is about the arrangement or an organization. So we do have that overlap, but then when you look at the botany side of it, it's looking at it more through not the organizational structure of that, but it's looking at it as the study as a whole and how those resources, you know, how botany actually is constructed and organized, like where things fall together. So that to me is a, you know, that kind of gets to the challenges when you're trying to create a controlled vocabulary that anyone can use, because different communities, different disciplines will be thinking about the term in a completely different way. And not to try to make this overly complicated, certainly those of you who have a more defined scope have this a little bit easier already, because you really only have to think, if you're doing something that would fall under the defined scope of botany, then you would look at terms related to taxonomy and botany, and then you would choose your preferred term and you would explain what that term is and sort out your synonyms, sort out your related words, all of that. If you're doing taxonomy and you want to define it for everybody, then you're going to want to do as they've done here, figure out how you're going to define it for specific domains. And this may be where, we're going to talk about this in just a second, we'll get to synonym rings, and we're going to talk about those in just a second. So looking at our robots example, they're similar thing as with botany and classification. If you're in manufacturing robots, you have all these different kinds of robots, and there's much more. I actually stood in the middle of a robot once. It was really, really cool. It was like a room-sized robot. So cool. Anyway, you know, you have all these different kinds of robots and they do different things. And one of the things in manufacturing is they're very, they view robots more through how that robot interacts with resources and how it works. So like a Cartesian robot is a robot that is mapping or doing some kind of measurement and things like that. Articulated robot is a robot that has something that it, sort of like hands or feet or something like that, and can actually grasp and do things. So it has to do with how the robot's used or what its purpose is. We go over to the IEE list of robots. They're organized not by sort of how that robot works or what it does. They're organized by disciplines. So a drone, that disaster response, education, entertainment, things like that. So it's organized less by purpose and more by sort of its larger or less by how it works and what it does, and more about how it engages in the world as a whole. So if we were going to use this particular list as a source for our controlled vocabulary, but we were developing something for manufacturer robots, we would also want to look at the list of manufacturing robots here, which is much more than just what I listed there. I just picked 4 things to list there, but I would want to take that list of sort of being those are the broad categories of manufacturing robots. And then I'd want to look at other resources related to manufacturing robots. I would want to get my list from things specifically about manufacturing robots. Now, let's say I were building something that was going to be, just more all about robots kind of thing. And I'm going to build a website that's all about robots. And how do I explain how this is organized? Well, I might start with this as categories because this makes a lot of sense. And then I might, although I see a couple of spots where I would question those in terms of whether or not I would really want to use that as a category or as a top level preferred term. And then I might want to take my manufacturing robots, maybe take my aerospace robots, but I would want to figure out how I could include these terms and where I would include some of these terms. Now, to me, this is sort of a mix of terms. So if I were to use this, I've got things like kind of types of robots, like a humanoid is a type of robot. And then I have things like, what is essentially uh, robots used in education. So it's the discipline robots are used in, and then also a little bit of what type of robot they are. So self-driving cars would be another category where it's a category, but it could fall under other things. And so in addition to aerospace, I might be inclined to add automobiles, and then I could put self-driving cars under that because there would probably be some other categories. So that's one of the things that you're looking at your word list and your word source is look and think about, and this will be important kind of going forward too, is thinking about where you might have words that are missing where you're going to need to add something else. And you can go ahead and add those to your word list, and then you'll sort them out and get your sort of figure out your hierarchy and things like that as you go along. But this is one of these ones where it's like, it's a good example to kind of look at it and see, like if you were to use this as a basis for your sort of top level categories in a controlled vocabulary, your top level preferred terms and your controlled vocabulary under the scope of robots, then you would probably want to think about it a little bit because there's sort of those top level categories mean a couple of different things or a few different things, and to try to make it equitable. So you could even, if you wanted to, you could change aerospace to transportation or something like that. Now, I would assume the aerospace would also include things like, outer space robots and satellite robots and things like that. So transportation might not be a good fit for that. So, maybe it'd be aerospace, and then we would have, personal and commercial transportation as another category or something like that. Or maybe we would just have another category for automobiles and, transportation that way or something like that. So robots, we go look at the Library of Congress subject headings. We say there's lots of robots here, and you'll notice the label and then also the different variations into how that data can be represented. And one of the interesting things I think is really interesting about the Library of Congress subject headings, if you look at the linked data services, you can also see the date that terms were created. And so that can be also helpful to kind of see, where we may be going in terms of some of these too. So robots is used as a topic, so as a preferred term right at the top, or not right at the top, but a preferred term, or we can use it under military services. So when we were looking at that pre-coordinated search string of merchant marines and then officers, we could have something like military -- robots, and that would be acceptable. We can't use robots under anything else though, which to me seems really weird. So we wouldn't have like education -- robots. It's clearly defined that robots is going to be used there or as its own topic. We also, and so this may be something that we'll look at these more and talk more about these next week, but use for So that's what UF means when you see Library of Congress subject headings. That means use robots instead of Ottomans. A broader term is robotics. So above robots is robotics. Below robots, so defining robots more, we have all of these category of robots. And so there we have military robots as its term underneath robots. So we don't really need the other, we wouldn't really need that military -- robots. We could just use military robots. And again, you notice when you're looking at these, we have robot hands, but there's no robot feet. And maybe there's not been any robot feet created yet, but there probably are. So, it is kind of interesting, like what narrower terms end up here. And it is primarily coming out of what is being, published or created or written about, things like that. We look over at the Department of Agriculture, the National Agricultural Library, and we look at their category for robots. We see that there's some subject category, technology and engineering. We have used for, so that'd be like the UF that we saw in the Library of Congress subject headings. It's a little bit different, robotic devices and equipment. Their broader term is handling machinery. Now remember, this is coming from the agricultural thesis, thesaurus, and glossary. So they're looking at it through that lens of agricultural use primarily. Of course, they have related terms, artificial intelligence, automation, and they kind of have terms that are similar but different. So the scope of how this term is used is different. But we can, when in practice, when we are using our controlled vocabulary, we can map to other controlled vocabularies, or we can use multiple controlled vocabularies together. So let's say that you are working on a website and it's going to be something agricultural, and it's got a bunch of robot stuff in it. So you're going to need some robot stuff represented. You could use this, and you could also, if the Library of Congress subject headings was of interest to you, you could also use those as well. So you can use multiple thesaurus together, and sometimes it depends upon the limits of your system. So we haven't talked too much about the limits of the system, but certainly that's one part of it. So a synonym, we've already looked at these. I wanted to give you a definition of that. Synonym, word or phrase that means exactly or nearly the same as another word or phrase in the same language. So example is shut is a synonym of close. Those are pretty close. And I say that it's nearly because, of course, our understanding, our lens, our understanding of that term really relates to the vocabulary we were taught and what we understand those words to mean. Then a synonym ring, and I just talked about this one a few minutes ago, that synonym ring or a synset is a group of data elements considered semantically equivalent for the purposes of information retrieval. So that gets to our robots, and then we were looking at handling machinery versus other kinds of robots. And these data elements are frequently found in different metadata registries. So that would be like the NAL thesaurus we looked at, or maybe the Getty thesaurus and Library of Congress thesaurus, or it might be your thesaurus and the Library of Congress thesaurus. So a synonym ring is a set. This is really meant to help our users. So it's done on the system side of things usually, but a synonym ring is a way to relate synonyms, and it helps in terms of the system being able to display or pull together these resources to say that they are equivalent for the purposes of retrieval, for the purposes of what people are searching. A synonym ring is typically a flat structure. It's not hierarchical of itself. And it can also be a way to provide access to content that is uncontrolled things like keywords too. This can also be where you see when you're searching, you'll sometimes see, did you mean this? You know, there's a suggestion like, oh, well, we search for gays instead of gases or whatever it may be that it thinks you want to search for. Now, are these always accurate? No, but it is an attempt to take a word that you might have misspelled or a commonly misspelled word or a word that people would also be looking for these sorts of things and being able to relate them together. Synonym ring looks like this. I know that we could argue very fine semantics of some of these terms. You know, prevention and abatement are not necessarily the same thing, but if people were searching for any of these terms, being able to find those resources, regardless if they use poverty prevention or if they use poverty elimination, that there is a relationship between those and being able to find them. Because obviously they're not quite the same exactly, but there is that relationship between them. So synonym rings, that's a way on a system side to be able to relate things that are related and for the system to be able to say, okay, also include these other things. Sometimes you can set these up in your systems. Other times it's maybe done by artificial intelligence. Maybe it's done by some other system entirely. You may or may not be able to, at least on a system side, create a synonym ring at all. But do know that that sometimes comes into play with our controlled vocabularies. So synonym rings, that's more of a system side of things. The other thing that can help is an authority file. We've talked a little bit about these. Authority file is also another way to bridge natural language being just whatever you type versus controlled vocabularies. Synonym rings themselves are used in the retrieval process. So when someone's searching, the system kind of tries to pull things together in different ways. And synonym rings are meant to ensure that the concept described by multiple synonymous terms or related terms can be retrieved if you're using any of those terms. So any of these terms, if you're searching for poverty elimination, you would also find things and be provided things about poverty prevention. Now, someone who is a very granular searcher and they really just want things that are about poverty elimination, they may not really be interested in these other things, but they may still end up getting sort of served or see those other things. We see a lot of this when we're searching in Google, right? Where it's like searches are close, but not quite. And a lot of that's just sort of waiting on terms, waiting in terms of ranking and trying to decide which term is the best. But there's a lot of this kind of thing of trying to figure out like what you might want besides what you've typed in. So, you know, back to our robots example, our engineering students have been assigned research on Cartesian robots. So these are mapping robots, robots that map and measure things. But they're having trouble finding robot related content on our website. And that would also include the library catalog. We have been charged with trying to help solve this dilemma because they're really having a terribly hard time. Now, there's lots of different ways in library land that we could do this, but we're just going to look at it from the data side and kind of talk about it from the controlled vocabulary side. So we go to our website search logs, our website search statistics, and we can see that they're searching the website for Cartesian robots. And, you know, there's not really anything there that has that as a vocabulary term, and they just leave. Or in web terminology, they bounce. They look for something, they can't find it, and they go off to Google land to see what they can find out. Our website pulls resources from the library catalog, so books and things like that, from our YouTube video library, as well as other library related content we have created on our website. So, you know, in our library catalog, we have some controlled vocabularies. YouTube, we have some tags. And then we have all the different things we've blogged about and posted about and things like that. So how could we resolve this? Well, depending upon what system we have on our website, we could set up that synonym ring. So that may be something that we could facilitate on the system side. Knowing that we have this particular dilemma where this giant class of engineering students come in looking for mapping robots and measuring robots and they can't find anything, but we know we have resources on them. So we could possibly on our CMS side, our website side, we could set up a synonym ring, or maybe we actually need to set up a controlled vocabulary taxonomy because we haven't had that before on the website itself. We could potentially map to other vocabularies from our existing one. So in the Library of Congress subject headings, maybe we need to add another vocabulary. So we could go into those records for those books and resources, and we could add another thesaurus in with the terms that they would be looking for a Cartesian robot. We could, of course, create a blog post, a tutorial, a video, whatever, highlighting these resources. Using the controlled vocabularies we have, plus the terms our students would use in their program. So that would be sort of a short-term, possibly a way of doing that. Or we could do all of these kinds of things. So here's an example of mapping synonyms to a preferred term. And different systems do different things. And, more web-based systems do this kind of thing where you have a term and we have publications. We see that publications is used 285 times. And we are going to say that if you are using publishing, that you should see the term publications. Same thing, if you see the term papers, you're going to look for publications. So we could refer our students back to those particular resources that have the controlled vocabulary on the website, if we're doing the website, for those particular resources. So for those of you, especially library-oriented folks, I would say look at, and you can even look at some of the things in your own library, and think about your controlled vocabularies, and think then about the areas where you have keywords. So for example, this contents of field with just, all kinds of words in it and things like that. You might have a summary or abstract that includes information, and think about how a synonym ring can be used, or it may already be used, so that you can find those resources. So things to consider as we wrap up here. What words to choose, determining your word stock, the sources for your controlled vocabulary. Your sources should align with your target user community for a specific controlled vocabulary. For those of you who are doing something general, that's going to be, a wide community. So you'll have to think about that a little bit. And then, of course, of those words, which words to include in the controlled vocabulary. And you can go ahead and start sorting out your synonyms and homophones and things like that. You'll be thinking about your preferred term or phrase. And we've talked about some of the approaches for that already. And then going forward, so in next week, we will be talking more about the relationships. So you can start and different people have different processes. I've tried to make this each week you do some part of the process. Next week, you really focus on the hierarchy. But if you want to, especially if you're a Post-it note person, it depends upon how you want to break down this work. It's okay for me if you want to go ahead and start working on your relationships and your hierarchy and sort of deciding what those will be. But the focus for this week is really sorting out your word stock and your terms. But going forward, you will need to be able to identify those relationships and hierarchies, and there's different ways of looking at that. Broad, narrow terms, parent, family, child, similar synonyms, that would be related terms. And next week, we will do a deep dive into the vocabulary structure in relationships. Do participate in the class discussion, do the assignments, and please continue to learn. I've enjoyed everyone's discussions and ideas thus far. And thank you. I will see you next week.